Sounds True presents The End of Your World. Uncensored straight talk on the nature of enlightenment with Adyashanti. Session 1. The Dawning of Awakening.
There's a phenomena happening in the world today. And this phenomena is that more and more people seem to be getting real, authentic glimpses of reality. More and more people seem to be having moments where they awaken out of their familiar sense of self, out of their familiar sense of what the world is, to a much greater reality, to something far, far beyond anything they knew. These kind of awakenings in many spiritual communities are becoming more and more common. Actually, what I found as a spiritual teacher is that people are waking up even outside of any religious context, sometimes with people who have never heard much about spirituality or certainly about Eastern teachings. So this phenomena of more people getting glimpses of reality, something beyond the common accepted perspective that we're all taught is true and real, something beyond our common sense of who and what we are, to something much greater and much truer. This is happening more and more often. So as a spiritual teacher, what I've had to do is start to address those people more and more, because there's more and more of them. In the beginning of my teaching work, most of the people who came to me were people who were seeking the deeper realizations of spirituality. They were seeking in some way to wake up from the dream they sensed they may be living in, from the limited and isolated sense of self that they imagine themselves to be. And this pull, this yearning, this intuition that there is something greater than we currently perceive, that who we think we are is somehow intuitively known not to really actually be the truth of our being. The intuition that possibly the world that we perceive is not actually the way it really is. This intuition is really at the seat of spiritual seeking and spiritual yearning. And over time, as I've been teaching, more and more people have been having glimpses of this greater reality. Whether those glimpses are something that's sustained and lasts, or something that's momentary, something that happens for maybe even a split moment or a split instant. And in that instant, suddenly, their whole sense of self disappears. The way they perceive the world suddenly changes and alters. And it's almost as if what they are is completely beyond any sense of separation that they could ever imagine. It's almost the experience of waking up from a dream that you didn't even know you were in until all of a sudden you somehow woke up out of it. Now, traditionally, of course, this is called spiritual awakening, when we awaken from the dream of separateness, from this dream that the egoic mind creates through its conditioning, through its images of itself, through its images of the world. All of these images, all these ideas, all these beliefs that we have form and construct a sense of ego or separate self. And with the dawning of awakening, at once and often quite suddenly, we realize that that self, that ego, is not really who we are. It doesn't define us in any way. It may exist as a series of passing thoughts and actions and reactions, but in and of itself, it has no identity. There is no center to the ego. Ultimately, the ego is nothing but a resistance against what is. It's the various ways that a body and a mind can resist life as it is. And so ego isn't a thing, it's more of a verb. It's the resistance of what is. It's the pushing away or pulling towards. And this momentum and this action of pushing away and pulling towards, grasping and rejecting, is what forms a sense of separate self. And from that sense of a separate self, we perceive the world as separate from ourselves, as something distinct and of its own. But with the dawning of awakening, this whole world begins to collapse. It's as if we lose the whole world as we knew it, and we lose our whole sense of self as we knew it. And at that moment, whether that moment is just a glimpse or that moment is something more sustained, at that moment we realize suddenly and with incredible clarity that what we are is in no way limited to who we thought we were. Now, it's very difficult to define, actually, what we realize ourselves to be in these moments of awakening. Many people describe it many ways. Some would awaken to realize that they are awareness itself. Some would say they're consciousness itself. I often say you wake up and realize that you are spirit, and all things and all beings are spirit as well. But with each of these descriptions, the mind creates another image. The mind creates another idea of what this ultimate truth or ultimate reality must be. And as soon as these images are created, they distort perception once again. So, in truth, it's really impossible to describe exactly what the true nature of reality is, except to say it's not at all what we think it is. It's not what we've been taught it is. And certainly, we ourselves are nothing we could ever imagine ourselves to be, because what we are is literally beyond all imagination. What we are is that which is watching us pretending to be a separate person, a separate being. What we are is that which is continually partaking of all experience. What we really are is that which is awake to each and every instant, each and every moment, each and every experience. In awakening, what's revealed to us is that we are not a thing or a person or an entity. That what we are is that which manifests as all things, all experiences, all personalities. We are that which dreams the whole world into existence. From a mind held in a conventional view with conventional ideas, this sort of notion is fanciful. It almost seems completely unreasonable. And to such a mind, you can never convince such a mind that maybe what they perceive is literally being dictated by what they think. Because a human mind and a human body is very much like a computer. We all know there's computer games that are based on virtual reality, which means you program the computer and it literally creates a whole world. And then if you're in the game, you go and you play the game in that world, and that world has certain rules of how it's run and how it's not run, and how things happen and how they don't happen, and what the goals of that world are, and what the purpose of that world is, and what the meaning of that world is. But that whole world is a virtual reality. And in the same way, as human beings, we get programmed. This is called our conditioning, or in the East they might call it our karma. And this conditioning is literally the way that our systems are programmed, our minds are programmed, our bodies are programmed. Our senses and our perceptions are literally programmed. And part of that programming creates a virtual reality. It literally creates the world that we tend to see and perceive. And it certainly creates the interpretation we make about what we see and what we perceive. And so sadly, most people, the vast majority of humanity, will live their whole lives in a virtual reality. They'll live their whole life basically from a reality that's created from their own imagination. They'll think the world is good, or the world is bad, or people should be like this, or people shouldn't be like this, or such and such shouldn't have happened. And all the ways that our minds judge the world and condemn the world and point fingers and grasp at it and push it away. All the ways that our mind gets caught in dualistic ideas like love and hate and anger and jealousy and pushing and pulling. All these ways that the mind gets caught and fixated. are not only mental fixations, are not only thoughts, but these thoughts and these beliefs literally give rise to perceptions. They color the way we see things. And so, very quickly in our lives as we grow up, we're literally taught to perceive ourselves as being separate from others. We're taught that we are essentially, and in the deepest realm of ourselves, that we are different from the world. That we and the world are two different things. That our neighbor, or our parent, or our friend, or even our dog or our cat are essentially something other than what we are. While on the surface of things, there's an obvious difference between a human being and a cat, or a parent and a child, or a mother and a daughter. On the surface of things, there are certainly differences, and yet these differences obscure an underlying reality which is really what gives birth to the spiritual longing, because this underlying reality always functions within us of an intuition or a longing for connectivity, for union, to heal this imaginary split. And it's very important to understand that this split between oneself and others, oneself and the world, is purely imaginary. It's being perceived only because our minds have been taught to perceive that way, are thinking along lines in which colors our perception. But there are times, there are moments when this whole virtual reality almost cracks, like an egg cracking, and a light comes through that crack. And at that moment, when consciousness opens to something else, it's as if our spirit, our consciousness, escapes this false confinement of virtual reality, of a virtual self in a virtual world, and at once recognizes, awakens to, or perhaps more accurately, literally remembers. Because this is what spiritual awakening is. It's really a remembering. It's not becoming something that we're not. It's not transforming ourselves. It's not changing ourselves. It's literally a remembering of what we are. But at the moment of this remembering, if this remembering is authentic, it's not viewed as a personal thing. There's really no such thing as a personal awakening, because personal would imply separation. Personal would imply that it's the me or the ego that awakens or becomes enlightened. But in a true awakening, it's realized very clearly that even the awakening itself isn't personal. It's the universal spirit or universal consciousness that wakes up to itself. It's not the me that wakes up. Actually, what we are wakes up from the me. What we are wakes up from the seeker. What we are wakes up from the seeking. And so this awakening is essentially very different than what we're often taught spiritual awakening is. There's a lot of confusion about what spiritual awakening is, what enlightenment is. So I think it's important that we clear some of this misunderstanding up. One of the greatest misunderstandings about awakening or enlightenment, that it is some sort of mystical experience, that it's some experience that's akin to union with God, or merging with the environment, or dissolving into the ocean when you're looking at the beach and the sunset is beautiful, and all of a sudden you just sort of merge into the environment. It's also different than all of a sudden having a tremendous amount of cosmic insights into the whole way the whole universe is constructed, and into the inner workings of the nature of what we think is reality. I could go on, but essentially what's important to realize that spiritual awakening is very different from a mystical experience. Mystical experiences are beautiful. They're really in many ways the highest experiences that a me can have. They're the most pleasurable experiences that a me can have. Because a me is always seeking, the ego is always seeking union. It's always seeking closeness, even though it's afraid of it, and at times being repelled by it. But essentially, the ego is always reaching out, wanting closeness. And many of the spiritual practices that people engage in are actually meant to produce some of these mystical kind of experiences, whether those experiences are experiences of merging or they're visionary experiences where we have visions of Mother Mary or the Buddha or Jesus or Allah or who knows what. The practices expand our consciousness and we feel like we are expanding through space and time. And on and on. Or a lot of these spiritual practices may seek to activate the essential energy within us, sometimes called the Kundalini. And this energy can be activated and start course through our system, and it can have some extraordinarily pleasurable effects. That is, if everything goes right. Very often when someone actively and assertively activates this innate, deep root energy, this Kundalini energy, the mere act of sort of forcing it awake or forcing it into the open will actually create a lot of problems in the energetic system. But one can have deep Kundalini experiences, deep energetic experiences, pleasurable or unpleasurable, and these aren't really ultimately the same as awakening. Again, I'm not saying they have no value. I'm not saying that they aren't transformative, because they often are transformative. Mystical experiences can change the structure of the egoic self to a radical degree, and in many times in very, very positive ways. So in the relative world of things, they have a value. But when we're talking about spiritual awakening, we're talking about something that is essentially awakening from the me. It's not really, certainly not initially, it's not really about transforming the me or changing the me. It's not concerned with the me having a better experience. It's literally a waking up from the dream of me. It's going from one paradigm to a completely different paradigm. It's as if going from one world to another world. I don't mean to imply that someone who's awake doesn't see the same world that you see. When you see a chair, someone who's awake sees a chair. If you see a car, someone who's awake sees a car. It's not that we see things differently necessarily, but the difference is when one is truly awakened, when they've really gone beyond the veil of the illusion of duality and separation. What's perceived is everything that looks different and distinct, actually in its essence, is the same. That everything we perceive, everything we see, everything we feel, everything we hear is literally a manifestation of the same thing. What that thing is can't be described. We call it God. We call it the Tao. Some would call it consciousness. Some would call it the ultimate nature of awareness. A Buddhist would call it Buddha nature, and on and on. There's many, many names for the unspeakable, for the unexplainable. But spiritual awakening really reveals that that which is unspeakable and unexplainable is actually what we are. It is the unspeakable. It is spirit itself that wakes up. This is really important to understand in spiritual awakening. Now, there are those who would say that if this awakening is momentary, if it opens up and then closes again, then it's not a real awakening, it's not authentic. There are those who would say that if it's true actual awakening, your perception will open up to the true nature of things, and it will never close back down again. Never again will you be deluded into separation. I can understand why someone would say that, because ultimately, where the whole spiritual journey leads is to a full awakening. Full awakening simply means that we perceive from spirit oneness, that we see that all is one, that there isn't actually any separation anywhere in all the world, in all the universe, in all universes everywhere, wherever they may be. The truth, which is another word for the absolute, for the true nature of our being, The truth is that which is true anywhere and everywhere, at all times, in all dimensions, to all beings. It's a truth that is the source of everything that will ever be experienced in life, after life, in this dimension, or any other dimensions. From the perspective of the ultimate, from the perspective of absolute spirit, everything, literally, higher or lower dimension, here or there, yesterday, today, or tomorrow, everything is but a manifestation of that spirit. And it's spirit that wakes up. So ultimately, the trajectory that every being is on, whether they know it or not, whether they're in cooperation with it or not, every being is on the trajectory to full awakening, to a full knowing, to a full experiential knowledge of what they are, of unity, of oneness. But at the moment of awakening, it may or may not be a permanent seeing. As I said, some people would say, unless it's permanent, it's not real. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because what I've seen as a teacher is that for someone who has a momentary glimpsing beyond the veil of duality, and someone who has a permanent residence where they're abiding, where their awakening is abiding, what they see, what they experience is the same thing. One person experiences it momentarily, another person experiences it continually. But what is experienced, if it's a true awakening, is the same. The fact that all is one. The fact that what we are is not a particular thing or a particular someone that can be located in a particular space. What we are is ultimately nothing and also everything simultaneously. So, as I see it, if you really awaken, whether it's momentarily or you're awakened continually, doesn't really matter. It matters in the sense that the trajectory, that nobody's heart will be totally fulfilled until that awakening, until that perception of truth, of perceiving from truth, is continuous. But what is seen is what is seen. What's most common for people is a momentary awakening, what I call the non-abiding awakening. It happens for a moment, a day, a week, an afternoon, maybe a month or two, and all of a sudden, like the aperture on a camera lens closes back down for reasons that are often not understood. It closes back down, and all of a sudden, that person who perceived that they were the one, that person who perceived true non-duality, true oneness, all of a sudden, quite surprisingly, is now perceiving back in duality, for what I call the dream state. In the dream state, we're back in our conditioned sense of self, in a limited, isolated sense of self. And this is probably the most common. Many people in spirituality, many people listening to what I'm saying, have had moments or a moment where everything seemed to open up and they saw things very clearly. But like the aperture on a camera lens, it's spontaneous at some point started to close down. Now, once a moment of clear seeing, of awakening to our nature has actually happened, the aperture really never can close down completely again. It can certainly seem like it closes down completely, that's for sure. But actually, it never quite closes down completely, because in the deepest part of oneself, you don't really ever forget. Something in you, even if you've glimpsed reality for a moment, is inextricably changed. Reality is nuclear. It's incredibly powerful. It's unimaginably potent. People can have a flash, literally in like the snap of a finger, of reality, and the energy and the force that enters into them as a result of that, even when they're not perceiving it anymore, is completely life-altering, completely life-changing. So reality is extraordinarily potent. This reality begins the dissolving of one's false sense of self. It begins the dissolving of one's whole perception of the world. And so I have always wanted to give a coherent set of teachings that have to do with what happens after awakening. And so I'm really happy that I have an opportunity to do this. Now, some people may think, I haven't had one of those glimpses. I don't think I've really awakened. Or some people may not even be sure if what they've experienced is awakening or not awakening. But whatever the case may be, rest assured that what happens after that glimpse, whether it's a glimpse or we are abiding in that state of awakening continuously, the process that unfolds after awakening is also very relevant to what happens before awakening. Because essentially the process isn't different. It's just after awakening, it's just that the process is happening from a different perspective, from a different view. After awakening, the process of spirituality happens from a bird's eye view rather than from a ground's eye view. So I think that whether you've awakened or think you've awakened or not, it really doesn't matter so much. But saying that, these teachings, what I want to present here, is really directed towards those who've had some awakening, whether it's non-abiding or abiding. Because there's very little information out about what happens after awakening. Very, very little. The information that is there about what happens after awakening is usually not very public. It's very, very private, and which means it's often talked only between teacher and student, and very rarely is it talked in public. The problem with that is a lot of people are having these moments now, or having glimpses, or actually are living from a much more awakened place. And yet there's no real coherent teaching about it. There's very few people talking about it in a way that really makes sense to them, that really talks from their perspective, or that seems particularly coherent. And so that's one of my aims, is to present a series of teachings which really are sort of a welcoming to that new world, that new perception of oneness, and to start to address what may be happening from that state of oneness. Now, the danger of this is obvious, or to some it may be obvious. The danger of what happens after awakening is that the teachings are taken on too much of a conceptual level. I often tell my own students, my teachings are not meant to be coherent statements of truth. I'm not teaching theology or philosophy. I'm not teaching Buddhism or any kind of ism at all. That's not my interest at all. My teachings are actually strategies for awakening, or strategies to help one with what happens after awakening. So these teachings aren't teachings that are meant to be understood simply on the mental level, on the conceptual level, and applied from the top down, as it were. These teachings are more suggestions. They're strategies. In many ways, the life after awakening, one of the most important things to what unfolds after awakening is to have some orientation to where you are. Because quite contrary to what many of us expected, which was we thought when awakening happened, if it ever happened, that as soon as awakening happened, everything would be clear. Everything. And actually, what you find out, that everything isn't clear. The one thing that's clear with a true and authentic awakening is reality. Who and what we are is clear. There's no longer doubt about that. There's no longer a question about it. It's a done deal. In a very real sense, one of the hallmarks of a true awakening is the end of seeking. You no longer feel the thrust and the push and the pull of seeking. The seeker literally disappears as the virtual reality it was. The seeker and the seeking has in many senses accomplished its task. It's provided the necessary momentum to help propel consciousness or spirit out of its identification with the dream state and helped it to return back to its natural state of being. But once this awakening happens, one of the things that's very curious for a lot of people is that their seeking disappears. Now, if it's the abiding type of awakening, the awakening that really doesn't go away, then the seeker and the seeking completely dissolves. If the awakening is of a non-abiding character, which again means that almost the aperture of reality opened for a moment or a day or a week, only to close somewhat again. In those cases, the seeker and the seeking may not be completely dissolved, but it's in the process of being dissolved. And this itself is quite a transformation in one's life. Because for people in spirituality, a lot of times their whole identity has been wrapped up in the seeking. Their life has literally been defined by spiritual seeking, by the yearning for God or union or enlightenment or awakening. And all of a sudden, awakening happens. And the person they thought they were, the seeker, the seeking, and the whole egoic structure, the spiritual ego gets built up around it, is suddenly gone, is seen to be what it was, possibly useful, but now seen as rather meaningless and not useful, and falls away. In many senses, once awakening happens, once the honeymoon of awakening is over, and the honeymoon of awakening is the initial aha, the initial bliss of realization, the joy of the awakening itself, the utter relief of no longer being burdened by a false perception of things, by this immense burden of separateness and all of the conditioning that we formerly identified with and thought we were and allowed to define us. And at once, with this peering beyond the veil of illusion, all that is dropped, maybe permanently, maybe momentarily. But either way, there's sort of a honeymoon, a great aha, incredible release, incredible relief. That release and that relief may itself be momentarily. The release and the relief may last for weeks or months. In some cases, it may last a few years, where you'll literally be sort of just basking in the bliss and the joy and the release of your own being, of what you truly are. And that's what I call the honeymoon period of awakening. But at some point, one starts to look around, and you start to realize that things have changed quite a bit. The orientation, that which oriented us in our lives before, is no longer there. Those beliefs that we grabbed on and used to orient ourselves and define ourselves are now seen to be empty, to be of no substance. A lot of the egoic motivations are now disappeared. Either they're completely disappeared, or if it's a momentary awakening, they're in the process of disappearing. This can be very, very disorienting to the mind, because it's only at this particular point that people start to realize that literally almost everything that motivated them in life was self-centered. And I don't mean that in a negative way or a judgmental way. I just mean that the energy that moved oneself in life, when we're in the dream state, when we're in the state of consciousness of egoic consciousness, literally the driving force, the energy that's propelling us through life is very self-centered. It's what I want, what I don't want, what can I achieve, who can love me, how much joy can I get, how much happiness can I get, how much unhappiness can I avoid, can I get the right job, can I find the right lover, will I get enlightened? These are all self-centered emotions, self-centered motivations. It comes from, the energy comes from the egoic state of consciousness. And again, this isn't bad or wrong. It's just the way it is. When we're functioning in the dream state, we're literally being fueled and propelled by the dream state. And our concerns are dictated by the dream state. Again, the dream state is the state where we perceive separation, where we think we're a separate entity and a separate being. And so that separate being is always seeking something: love, approval, success, money, maybe even enlightenment. But with real awakening, that whole structure begins to disappear. It begins to dissolve under one's feet. And of course, there's still a human being there. And in many ways, the basic personality of the human being has survived intact. Awakening doesn't necessarily demolish our personality. It doesn't dissolve our personality. It dissolves our identification with ego and our identification with personality. But every body has a personality structure. Jesus had a personality. Buddha had a personality. Everybody that walks on the earth has a personality. Infants, when they come out of their mother's wombs, have personalities. Before they've ingested any of the conditioning of society, before their teachers or parents have taught them how to create a personality. It's inherent in being. It's one of the beauties of being that every being has a different personality. Dogs and cats have different personalities, one to the other. Birds have different personalities. Trees have different personalities. So, once we've seen beyond the veil of separation, there's still a basic personality structure there. Depending on how deeply we've seen, or how transformative the scene has been, the egoic structure is much looser. It may be all but dissolved. But there's still a basic personality structure. There's still a human. And that human now has all of its old orienting principles, all of its drives, all of its self-centered drives are now either disappeared or they're in the process of disappearing. Now, this can be extraordinarily disorienting to people. I have many people that come to me and have many, many questions about this particular part of the process. In my own case, I had my first glimpse beyond the veil, my first awakening when I was 25. It was of the non-abiding variety. It didn't stay permanent, but it's certainly something about that scene of reality never left. I never really lost sight of it. Somewhere inside, I always knew that everything was one, that what I was eternal, was unborn, undying, and uncreated. That my essential nature was not limited or confined to the personality structure of the body that I seemed to be inhabiting. And yet, at that initial glimpse of reality, that initial awakening to my true nature, it wasn't really completely abiding, but there was the dissolving in a somewhat radical way of the world as I had seen it, the self that I knew myself to be. It was actually quite odd to be walking around in life without all these self-motivations. I wouldn't say they were all gone by any means. There was still some self-centered motivations and egoic-centered energy still happening. I'll talk about some of that later as we go on. But there was an immense amount of disillusionment at the level of ego and the level of the basic energy force that's derived from ego. And all of a sudden, what motivated me before, I wasn't motivated by. I walked around going, well, why should I do this? Why should I do that? I'm not really motivated to do this anymore, or that anymore. The things I love doing, I didn't necessarily love doing anymore. It's not that I resisted them or hated doing them. It's just that there was an absence of self-centered energy. And it was very disorienting for quite some time. And I find this with lots of people that I speak with. People come to me and say, gee, I used to have all these things I love to do. I used to have hobbies, and I used to like to go to dinner parties, or, whatever it was. I used to be into kite flying, or, running, or whatever it is. And it's common for some of these interests to start to wane. This doesn't mean all your interests will wane, but those that are being derived from the energy of separation, that are literally expressions of divisions of ego, those interests will start to disappear. Those motivations will suddenly seem like almost as if, where did they go? And initially, there's nothing often that replaces it. As we're dissolving, as a glimpse of reality begins the dissolving of the egoic structure in earnest, this dissolving is very disorienting. We look around and we think, I always wanted my ego to dissolve. If we're in spiritual practice, it's one of the things that we hope for, that I won't be confined to this ego forever, that maybe I can wake up from it or it will dissolve. Well, awakening itself isn't the same as egoic dissolving. We can wake up whether our ego is dissolved or not. In fact, very, very strong egos can awaken. Very destructive egos can awaken. But the result of the awakening, the fallout of the awakening, the aftermath of the awakening, on the human level, is a radical dissolving of ego. It begins the process. This doesn't mean the ego will be in cooperation. Ego may resist this dissolving with everything it has. Ego may resist this dissolving with the entirety of its arsenal. But nonetheless, reality will have begun the process. The disillusionment has begun. And ultimately, once you've had the glimpse, there's nothing you can do to stop it, not forever. But this dissolving, as I've said, can be very disorienting. And one of the things I often say to people is, of course, it's disorienting to your mind. Awakening itself can be very disorienting. Everything you thought was true, you now see isn't. The person you thought you were, you now see you're not. That itself can be at once blissful and a tremendous relief, and it can also simultaneously be experienced as very disorienting. Like, who am I going to be now? And what's going to move me? And what's going to motivate this being? Now, of course, if one was fully awake, one wouldn't have these questions. But that's very rare initially. Mostly, there's a process after this awakening. And so there are these questions and there are these experiences. And there's no pat answers that a spiritual teacher can give to somebody. Oh, here's how to orient yourself. Because that would just be taken by the ego again. What's much more useful is just to understand that to be disoriented is part of the process of awakening. It's totally natural to be disoriented because everything's new. You're new. Your perception is new. Your perception of everything and everyone is now changed. It's altered. And yet, the disorientation actually arises because the mind is struggling to know. It's like when you fall out of a plane. If you're just falling through space, there's no problem. But imagine you're falling through space and you start to grasp at space as if to find your bearings, as if to stop your fall. As soon as you start grasping, you feel very disoriented. You don't know which is up and which is down, or where you are or where you're not. So the disorientation is not necessarily inherent in the awakened view. The disorientation actually arises from the mind trying to find orientation. But one of the keys to the awakened view is there isn't an orientation. Literally, you find your orientation through not trying to find your orientation, by a total letting go. Now, there's a phase where when we let go and we're disoriented, the new energy that will move our lives does not immediately arise. Because there is an energy that moves all of our lives. And of course, it is moving in our lives all the time. But there is a gap as the egoic self is dissolving. And as it dissolves, there is also a new energy, a new force that comes in. It's the force that comes from non-division. It's the energy that comes straight from non-division, straight from the source, without being distorted. But often there's a gap between that arising, or that kind of energy becoming conscious, that motivating principle becoming conscious, and the dissolving of ego. So for most people, this further dissolving of egoic structure after awakening will go on for some years. That may be good news for some people, it may be bad news for some people. But for most people, awakening actually begins the dissolution, the dissolving of the entire ego structure. And again, by ego, I don't mean necessarily one's personality. What I mean by ego is that which is essentially a resistance to life and a resistance to death. Ego is that which perceives separation, that which causes the inner sense of division. Ego is a resistance to what is. And that's what really dissolves in earnest in the wake of awakening. And as I said, for most people that takes years. In my case, there was a 6-year period of the dissolving of the ego before there was an even deeper realization or awakening. Not essentially different, but much clearer, much deeper, much more complete. But in order for that to happen, this 6 years of the dissolving of ego was necessary to take place. I can see that looking back. And so I'm not unlike the vast majority of people in spirituality. They also have glimpses and then have this dissolving of ego. And then through the dissolving have a more clear and much deeper perception of reality. And it's that part of the journey after awakening, that's really the further dissolving of the egoic structure, but also the further clarifying of true nature, that really all these teachings are about. The vast majority of what happens after awakening is that point from the first glimpse to really being liberated, really being free of the tendency of ego to cause misperception, to cause and create the perception of separation.
Session 2, Non-Abiding Awakening, or I Got It, I Lost It, with Adyashanti.
There's a metaphor that I like to use for describing the journey from non-abiding awakening to abiding awakening. And the metaphor is simply a simple thing. It's of a rocket ship. And a rocket ship, of course, takes a tremendous amount of thrust and a tremendous amount of energy to break the gravitational force of the Earth initially just to get off the ground. And as it travels through the sky and then ultimately into space, if it gets far enough, if there is enough thrust or fuel in the rocket, it can eventually get beyond the gravitational field of the Earth. Once the rocket is beyond the gravitational field of the Earth no longer has the power to pull it back towards itself. And I use this metaphor because if we think of the egoic structure, the me, the perception of separateness, or what I just sometimes call the dream state, as the Earth, the dream state has a gravitational force. It has a tendency to pull consciousness into itself. Form itself tends to pull consciousness to itself, pull awareness into itself. And so this gravitational force of the dream state is really what one is dealing with throughout the entirety of spirituality. Awakening essentially is breaking free of this gravitational force. Initially, it simply may be the leaving of the dream state, awakening from the dream state of meanness and separation and isolation. But we can break away from this dream state, awaken from the dream state, to the true nature of things, to what we truly and really are. But because we've awoken does not mean that consciousness has got outside of the gravitational force of the dream state. If we haven't gotten outside of the gravitational force of the dream state, we're going to be subjected to it, and we're going to be pulled back towards it. And this gives rise to this phenomena that many, many people that are familiar with, I call it the I got it, I lost it. I had this amazing realization about the truth, and then the next day, the next month, the next week, the next year, I seem to have lost it. It's almost like a rocket ship that left the ground, got a few miles up into the atmosphere, and then the fuel ran out, and now it's being pulled back inextricably towards Earth. Using this metaphor, this is a way of thinking about or contextualizing the process of awakening. Now, awakening itself, going from the dream state to reality, isn't a process, and it always happens spontaneously. But even though the moment of awakening isn't a process, there is a process that unfolds after awakening. It's not necessarily a process of becoming better or more or different. It's more the process of disillusionment, of dissolving, of essentially getting out of the gravitational force of the dream state. So when we have that experience of seeming to awaken out of the dream state to total clarity, and then the next moment being unawakened back into the gravitational force of duality, that's something we have to deal with. People come to me all the time and say, Ajahn, I'm awake, but. And of course, as soon as they say but, what I know as a teacher is that in that moment, they're not awake. They may have had a moment where they broke through the confines of duality and perceived truth. That's possible. But as soon as someone says, I'm awake, but, I know in that moment they're not awake. And all that's relevant in terms of awakening is right here and right now. The question isn't, have I had an awakening? The question is awakening awake right here and right now? Now, when someone comes to me and says, Ajahn, I had an awakening, the first thing I want to clarify that with that person is I want to see if their mind hasn't already co-opted the awakening. Because if they're saying I as an ego, as a me, had an awakening, that's just another illusion. If it's a true awakening, what we know is it's not the me that awoken. Awakeness woke up from the me. Spirit woke up from its identification with ego. The ego does not awaken. The me does not awaken. We are not the ego, we are not the me. We are that which is awake to the ego. We are that which is awake to the me. We are that which is awake to the world. And we are the whole world as well, when seen from the true perspective. So first, as a teacher, I always want to see, is someone claiming awakening from the standpoint of an ego? Do they really believe I as a me has awoken? Of course, in conventional language, we use terms like I and me, so it's perfectly fine to use those kind of words. But nonetheless, it's the first thing I try to clarify as a teacher, and I think everybody should clarify within themselves to be very certain that it's not the me who is awoken. Awakeness woke up from the me. Or I like to say sometimes, it's enlightenment that's enlightened. It's not the me that's enlightened. It's not the person that's enlightened. It's enlightenment is enlightened. that may be hard to understand until one experiences it for oneself. But of course, all of spirituality is like that. Everything must be verified for oneself and verified in oneself. But this phenomenon of I got it, I lost it is very, very common. And if you think about it, it's the struggle, as it were, between our true nature and our imagined nature, our imagined sense of self, going back and forth. Means our consciousness hasn't quite got out of the gravitational field of the dream state of ego. And so often vacillates between the two, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. This can be very, very disconcerting. In some senses, it's almost a bit schizophrenic in a way. It's not true schizophrenia, of course, but it's a bit schizophrenic because once we've seen the deeper reality of things, and then we find ourselves back into the dream state, it's very odd because part of us knows the deeper reality. Part of us knows that the egoic structure isn't true. Part of us knows that whatever our mind believes, or whatever interpretation it's making, whatever our hang-up is, part of us knows it's not true. Part of us knows it's literally nothing but a dream in the mind and body. But simultaneously, the gravitational force of the dream state can still be very strong. So even as we know that, we can actually still be believing in ego. So it's very odd to be knowing that a thought within oneself absolutely has no validity, absolutely isn't true, and simultaneously believing that it is true. Before we awakened, we just believed a thought or we didn't believe a thought. That's all we knew. It was sort of one or the other. But after awakening, for a lot of people, after a glimpse of awakening, or what I call non-abiding awakening, it can be very strange, very disconcerting to believe and not believe simultaneously, or to act in a way that you know isn't actually coming from the undivided vision that you have seen, but you act that way anyway, and you're almost compelled by inner forces you don't understand to behave in a way that you know is not true. Now, there's many, many, many examples of this, but for those who have had these kind of experiences, I can only say that this is very common. It sounds very strange and it feels very, very confusing. And it feels for those people that they've made a great leap backwards, that they sort of de-evolved, that somehow they've made some terrible mistake, because how is it that you could be believing a thought and not believing a thought at the same time? How is it that you could be in a conversation with somebody and saying things that aren't really coming from the truth, that are actually coming from ego? But now you know where they're coming from and you know they're not true, but somehow you're saying them anyway. This is very disconcerting. And so a lot of people will assume somehow they've made a mistake, somehow something has gone terribly wrong. But what's important to know is nothing's gone wrong. No mistake has been made. It's just the next phase in one's awakening. It's the next unfolding. The truth of the matter is, it's very, very rare that someone's initial awakening ends up in abiding awakening, that kind of awakeness, that perception of one, that is abiding, which means is continuous, which doesn't go away, where the aperture doesn't close down. That's relatively rare. It happens, but not near as often as the other, which is where the awakening vacillates. Now, as I said before, some teachers would say, if the awakening vacillates, then it's not true awakening. I'm not one of them, for reasons that I've already described. Because if we've seen the truth, we've seen the truth. If we've seen it for 2 seconds or 2,000 years, it's the same truth, if we've seen the truth. And at that point, then we have to be able to deal with, in a wise way, what do we do at this particular phase where awakening literally vacillates, turns on and off by itself, like a light switch that somebody's turning on and off that you have no seemingly control over. But once you start to understand first that nothing's gone wrong, that this is just the next part of your journey. And as long as you run from this part of the journey, as long as you try to solve this dilemma by running back and finding that awake place, then you're actually avoiding this part of the journey. But once you realize there's no problem here, there may be still some confusion, and this vacillation at times can be painful. At times it can be very painful. In fact, it's much more painful to act in a way that we know is not true once we really know it's not true. Before we may have acted in ways that were based on untruth, but we didn't know it. We were totally in the dream state. As Jesus said, forgive them for they know not what they do. Which is literally when we're in the dream state, we don't know what we are doing. We're simply acting in very programmed ways. But if we've really seen through the true nature of things, if reality within us is woken up, if spirit has opened its eye within us, now we know. There's a much more accurate sense of when we're moving or speaking or even thinking from truth and when we're not. And then when we go ahead and move from untruth anyway, it's much, much more painful than when we didn't know it was untrue. So the stakes go up. The more awake we get, the higher the stakes get. I remember staying at a monastery, a Buddhist monastery for a while that I visited, and the abbess there, this wonderful woman, talked about this process of awakening. And she said it's like climbing a ladder. With each step you go, you have less and less of a tendency to look down, which means you have less and less of a tendency to act in ways you know aren't true, or speak in ways you know aren't true, or do things that you know aren't coming from truth. Because if you do, you start to realize that the consequences that you experience become greater and greater and greater. And the more awake we get, the greater the consequences get. Until finally the consequences get so immense that even for the slightest movement or action or behavior that's not in accordance with the truth that we know, the consequences for us can become extraordinarily high. So this isn't something we count on in awakening. We think that freedom is just sort of just a get out of jail free card. Initially, we have a relationship with spiritual freedom that's actually quite infantile. That freedom is just a personal thing. That it's just about me feeling extraordinarily good and free. But it's much more nuanced than that. In one sense, it's complex but also simple. Freedom isn't just a personal thing. It's not an acquisition for us. As we become more conscious, more awake, there's also consequences to the awakening. There's consequences to everything. And what you find is when you move and behave in ways that are not in harmony with what you know to be true, the consequences get higher and higher. And so there are good reasons, or I should say there are reasons, why awakening vacillates. And most of those reasons have to do with unresolved conflicts within ourselves. They have to do with the remaining conditioning areas within ourselves that this awakening didn't penetrate through, and so therefore couldn't become totally free from. This shouldn't be mistaken as a self-improvement plan, because it's not. This isn't a becoming a perfect being. This is about seeing through in oneself what causes division. It's very different than having a goal of a perfect person. Because an awakening enlightenment has nothing to do with one's image of a perfect person or a holy person or a saintly person. What's truly holy is a whole being, is perceiving from wholeness, which means that we as a human being are not divided inside. And it's that which divides us inside, which causes the literal physical experience of division within us. whatever causes that experience of division, that's what needs to be healed, because that is contributing to us staying within the gravitational pull of the dream state. So at this phase of awakening, it requires a real radical honesty, a real willingness to really look at how we literally unenlighten ourselves, how we bring ourselves back into the gravitational force of the dream state. And this phase is, as I said, it really requires a deepest sense of honesty. Now, as a spiritual teacher, to get people to this state of honesty or to suggest that they go there can be quite difficult, because there's a great tendency in the egoic structure to begin using a moment where one perceived reality as a reason to hide from all of one's inner divisions. It's very common for people to come to me that have had some scene of a deeper truth, and I'll start to suggest some of the things I'm talking about in this talk, and they'll say, but there's nobody to do it. There is no person here. The ego and the person is an illusion, so there's really no one to really even look inside. There really isn't anything to be done. From the perception of awakening, there isn't a problem. Even when things are a total mess, from the perception of awakening, there isn't a problem. Therefore, there's nothing to do. Therefore, if you perceive anything other than there's something to do, they would conclude, then you're deluded. This kind of person is very, very hard to get through. And this is one of the real dangers of awakening, that we grasp at a lopsided view of awakening. We grasp at the absolute view of awakening, and we deny anything else. And as soon as we grasp at any view, we've gone blind to everything else. And so, as I said, it can be very, very difficult for any spiritual teacher to get someone to stop holding on to their fixation in an absolute view. It's hard to get them to see that it's actually the ego that fixates in the absolute view and literally can use the absolute view as an excuse for dismissing very unenlightened behaviors, very unenlightened thought patterns, very unenlightened or divided emotional states. And so that's why I say part of this journey, this particular part of the journey, is the willingness, the sincerity to be really, really honest with oneself. Yes, there is the absolute view. It's true there is no problem. It's true there is no separate self. It's true there is nobody to do what I'm speaking about. But I'm not speaking to the ego here. I'm not telling the ego it needs to do something or doesn't need to do something. I'm not speaking to any sense of a separate self. What I'm speaking to is directly to the reality itself. Spirit is speaking to spirit here. Reality is speaking to reality. It may sound like I'm talking to a person and directing a person, but I'm not. What I'm speaking about here is inherent within the perception of awakening itself. That which is awake always moves towards that which is not awake. That which is awake has no fear of that which is not awake. It doesn't have any fear because it doesn't perceive anything as separate or other than itself. That which is awake doesn't even perceive delusion or the dream state as separate or other than itself. It sees that everything is itself, equally itself, but also in a very subtle way, but if we're very honest, it's very noticeable. Inherent within the truth of our being itself is a desire. Of course, to say desire is not really true, but I don't know what other word to use. There is an inherent movement towards the releasing of any limitation, the releasing of any sense of confinement, the releasing of hate, ignorance, and greed, the releasing of itself from the dream state. So that's the perspective that I'm talking about here. That's where I'm talking from. This is where the truth of our being is not totally content until it has freed itself of its own misunderstanding, its own fixations, its own illusions. And to allow that to happen as a human being, as the appearance of a human being, we have to be willing to be very honest with ourselves. While not denying what we've seen, we also have to see, how is it right here and right now? What in me can still go into division? What in me can still go into hate, to ignorance, to greed? What in me can cause me to feel divided, isolated, to go into sorrow? Where are those spots in oneself that are less than awakened? Because that which is awakened in us is compassionate. Its nature is undivided, unconditioned love. So it doesn't move away from that which is unawakened. It moves towards it. That within us which is awake, it doesn't move away from our own contradictions in our thought patterns and behaviors. It doesn't move away from fixations. It doesn't move away from pain. Quite the opposite. It moves towards it. That's why so many beings throughout time, the truly, really enlightened beings, the fully awake beings, who have proclaimed and who you can feel in their energy field, they know that everything is good, that all is well. Ultimately, even though things may appear to be a mess, that all is well, even the mess is well. But those very beings that perceive that perceive total unity, that perceive no need to change anything or anybody, that see that everything is divine and perfect as it is. Isn't it ironic that they are often the very ones that are actually tending to those who are suffering, to those who don't perceive truth, to those who don't perceive reality? Now, why would they do that? If everything is perfect as it is, if nothing needs to change, if everything is holy and divine exactly as it is, if all is well, even when all isn't well, if that's the only thing they realize, then why are they dedicating their lives to the welfare of others? What would be the point? Well, there wouldn't be a point. They wouldn't be doing it. I would suggest the reason that so many people who get that far in their own awakening end up dedicating themselves to the welfare of others is because without denying that view, which I would call the absolute view, they also haven't fixated in that view. And so they're open to perceiving something more. They're open to perceiving the inherent compassion of reality itself. Yes, it's uninvolved. Yes, it never goes into conflict or upset about anything, but also inherent in its nature is unconditional love, unconditional compassion. It is in the process of awakening all of itself to itself. And that view, that part of the picture, is going to be very hard to see if we fixate in the absolute view. If we use the absolute view to hide from our humanness, because our humanness is divine. And so our humanness also seeks to be really penetrated through and through with truth and with reality. And so for this process of real complete awakening to fulfill itself, there's necessity to be really sincere. And this is very different than a therapeutic approach. This isn't going into oneself to try to fix everything in order to be happy. That's from a different perspective. That's from the perspective of the dream state. And that may be useful if we're in the dream state. But what I'm talking about is a totally different motivation. It's the inherent nature of reality to awaken all of itself to itself. That's its nature. That's what it's doing. And inside of you and inside of everybody, that is actually what's happening. It's reality moving to wake all of itself up to itself. And everything within our human structure is going to be uncovered. The necessity is we're going to have to come completely out of hiding from anything. As people sometimes ask me, well, Aja, what does this actually mean? What should I be doing? And I say, just start with something very simple. Stop avoiding anything that's unresolved in yourself. Turn, face it, look at it. Stop avoiding it. Stop moving into another way. Stop using a moment of awakening as a means to not deal with something that may be less than awake within you. Start to face it. Start to see it. And in the simple willingness to see yourself, in the simple truthfulness of sincerity, the truth starts to reveal ourselves to ourselves. It's not necessarily a technique-oriented endeavor here. The technique is sincerity. We really need to want the truth. We need to want the truth even more than we want to experience the truth. And this sincerity isn't something that we can impose. It's inherent within reality itself. There is a radical sincerity and self-honesty and simplicity. This may be hard to come by. It may be hard to uncover for some people, because it can come as quite a surprise that we can have an amazing glimpse, opening to the true nature of things. And then when we come back into the gravitational field of duality, we come back into a perception of body and mind, and we can find the body and mind can still be horrendously conflicted. And this can be very surprising, not only for the person that it's happening within, but for those around them. Because at 1 minute, such a person can be extraordinarily wise. And then the next minute, they can be extraordinarily deluded. And this isn't only confusing to the person, it's confusing to everybody around them. In fact, it gets some people to doubt the whole nature of awakening itself. Like, what's it all about? So somebody has a great awakening experience, but they're still sort of a jerk. Who cares? Well, that conclusion, while understandable, can only be made by someone who doesn't actually fully understand the process of awakening. The fact that we can have a very deep seeing of the true nature of things, and on the human level, still be very conflicted and deluded in certain areas of our life. And the sincerity is to no longer shy away from that, to actually look, turn, and face any place and anywhere where we perceive something less than awakeness, something less than unity, where we perceive a divisiveness in us, and to face it.